we have seen, and how contented we have felt, and why was this blessed change?' He stopped her with a motion of his hand, and bade her talk to him no more just then, for he was busy. After a time he kissed her cheek, still motioning her to silence, and walked on, looking far before him, and sometimes stopping and gazing with a puckered brow upon the ground, as if he were painfully trying to collect his disordered thoughts. Once she saw tears in his eyes. When he had gone on thus for some time, he took her hand in his, as he was accustomed to do, with nothing of the violence or animation of his late manner, and so, by degrees so fine that the child could not trace them, he settled down into his usual quiet way, and suffered her to lead him where she would. When they presented themselves in the midst of the stupendous collection, they found, as Nell had anticipated, that Mrs Jarley was not yet out of bed, and that, although she had suffered some uneasiness on their account overnight, and had indeed sat up for them until past 11 o'clock, she had retired in the persuasion that, being overtaken by storm at some distance from home, they had sought the nearest shelter, and would not return before morning. Nell immediately applied herself with great assiduity to the decoration and preparation of the room, and had the satisfaction of completing her task and dressing herself neatly before the beloved of the royal family came down to breakfast. 'We haven't had,' said Mrs Jarley when the meal was over, 'more than 8 of Miss Monflathers's young ladies all the time we've been here, and there's 26 of 'em, as I was told by the cook when I asked her a question or two and put her on the free list. We must try 'em with a parcel of new bills, and you shall take it, my dear, and see what effect that has upon 'em.' The proposed expedition being one of paramount importance, Mrs Jarley adjusted Nell's bonnet with her own hands, and declaring that she certainly did look very pretty, and reflected credit on the establishment, dismissed her with many commendations, and certain needful directions as to the turnings on the right which she was to take, and the turnings on the left which she was to avoid. Thus instructed, Nell had no difficulty in finding out Miss Monflathers's boarding and day establishment, which was a large house with a high wall, and a large garden gate with a large brass plate, and a small grating through which Miss Monflathers's parlour-maid inspected all visitors before admitting them. For nothing in the shape of a man, no, not even a milkman, was suffered without special licence to pass that gate. Even the tax-gatherer, who was stout and wore spectacles and a broad-brimmed hat, had the taxes handed through the grating. More obdurate than gate of adamant or brass, this gate of Miss Monflathers's frowned on all mankind. The very butcher respected it as a gate of mystery, and left off whistling when he rang the bell. As Nell approached the awful door, it turned slowly upon its hinges with a creaking noise, and, forth from the solemn grove beyond, came a long file of young ladies, 2 and 2, all with open books in their hands, and some with parasols likewise. And last of the goodly procession came Miss Monflathers, bearing herself a parasol of lilac silk, and supported by 2 smiling teachers, each mortally envious of the other, and devoted unto Miss Monflathers. Confused by the looks and whispers of the girls, Nell stood with downcast eyes, and suffered the procession to pass on, until Miss Monflathers, bringing up the rear, approached her, when she curtsied and presented her little packet, on receipt whereof Miss Monflathers commanded that the line should halt. 'You're the waxwork child, are you not?' said Miss Monflathers. 'Yes, ma'am,' replied Nell, colouring deeply, for the young ladies had collected about her, and she was the centre on which all eyes were fixed. 'And don't you think you must be a very wicked little child?' said Miss Monflathers, who was of rather uncertain temper, and lost no opportunity of impressing moral truths upon the tender minds of the young ladies, 'to be a waxwork child at all?' Poor Nell had never viewed her position in this light, and not knowing what to say, remained silent, blushing more deeply than before. 'Don't you know,' said Miss Monflathers, 'that it's very naughty,
and unfeminine, and a perversion of the properties wisely and benignantly transmitted to us with expansive powers to be roused from their dormant state through the medium of cultivation.' The two teachers murmured their respectful approval of this home thrust, and looked at Nell as though they would have said that there indeed Miss Monflathers had hit her very hard. Then they smiled and glanced at Miss Monflathers, and then, their eyes meeting, they exchanged looks which plainly said that each considered herself Smiler in ordinary to Miss Monflathers, and regarded the other as having no right to smile, and that her so doing was an act of presumption and impertinence. 'Don't you feel how naughty it is of you,' resumed Miss Monflathers, 'to be a waxwork child, when you might have the proud consciousness of assisting, to the extent of your infant powers, the manufactures of your country, of improving your mind by the constant contemplation of the steam engine, and of earning a comfortable and independent subsistence from 2 and 9pence to 3 shillings per week? Don't you know that the harder you are at work, the happier you are?'
'How doth the little,' murmured one of the teachers in quotation from Dr Watts.
'Eh?' said Miss Monflathers, turning smartly round. 'Who said that?'
Of course the teacher who had not said it indicated the rival who had, whom Miss Monflathers frowningly requested to hold her peace, by that means throwing the informing teacher into raptures of joy. 'The little busy bee,' said Miss Monflathers, drawing herself up, 'is applicable only to genteel children. In books or work, or healthful play, is quite right as far as they are concerned, and the work means painting on velvet, fancy needlework, or embroidery. In such cases as these,' pointing to Nell with her parasol, 'and in the case of all poor people's children, we should read it thus: In work, 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 in work alway, let my first years be passed, that I may give for every day some good account at last.' A deep hum of applause rose not only from the two teachers, but from all the pupils, who were equally astonished to hear Miss Monflathers improvising after this brilliant style. For although she had been long known as a politician, she had never appeared before as an original poet. Just then somebody happened to discover that Nell was crying, and all eyes were again turned towards her. There were indeed tears in her eyes, and drawing out her handkerchief to brush them away, she happened to let it fall. Before she could stoop to pick it up, one young lady of about 15 or 16, who had been standing a little apart from the others, as though she had no recognized place among them, sprang forward and put it in her hand. She was gliding timidly away again, when she was arrested by the governess. 'It was Miss Edwards who did that, I know,' said Miss Monflathers predictively. 'Now, I am sure that was Miss Edwards.' It was Miss Edwards, and everybody said it was Miss Edwards, and Miss Edwards herself admitted that it was. 'Is it not,' said Miss Monflathers, putting down her parasol to take a severer view of the offender, 'a most remarkable thing, Miss Edwards, that you have an attachment to the lower classes which always draws you to their sides? Or rather, is it not a most extraordinary thing that all I say and do will not wean you from propensities which your original station in life have unhappily rendered habitual to you, you extremely vulgar-minded girl?' 'I really intended no harm, ma'am,' said a sweet voice. 'It was a momentary impulse indeed.'
'An impulse?' repeated Miss Monflathers scornfully. 'I wonder that you presume to speak of impulses to me.' Both the teachers assented. 'I am astonished.' Both the teachers were astonished. 'I suppose it is an impulse which induces you to take the part of every grovelling and debased person that comes in your way. Both the teachers suppose so too. 'But I would have you know, Miss Edwards,' resumed the governess in a tone of increased severity, that you cannot be permitted, if it be only for the sake of preserving a proper example and decorum in this establishment, that you cannot be permitted, and that you shall not be permitted, to fly in the face of your superiors in this exceedingly gross manner. If you have no reason to feel a becoming pride before waxwork children,